Let me ask you the most basic question. If there is something of a new paradigm that businesses are facing, investors are facing, what is that paradigm and how does it change what they do in China?
Well, that really is a great question, and thank you so much for having me back again. I'm delighted to be with you. We look at this really as Xi 3.0. We're looking at a whole new world in some ways for foreign companies doing business in China. One, Xi Jinping is entering into a very political year as he attempts to take on the presidency for the third time. Now, as part of the party, a general secretary, there were no term limits, but for the first time, he is well positioned after 10 years to really take control in a way that we haven't seen since Mao. And what I mean is, over the last 10 years, it's almost been like a chess game where he has been able to position many of his people into positions of leadership that now when he takes on this third term, they will be his people with his vision to implement his policies. So what does this really mean for the foreign business community? One, the Chinese have been very clear that they want to continue to open to foreign firms, but they're going to do it in their own way. It's not going to be across every sector, but there still will be huge opportunity. But at the same time, they're going to be looking at implementing a whole series of regulations, in some ways almost to make China more professional. It's been a little bit of the Wild West as we've seen the growth of large firms like Alibaba and Tencent and Meituan and others. They're looking to break down that monopoly power, in part because of concerns about clearly the threat to the party, but also because over 95% of China's businesses are small and medium-sized enterprises, and they're responsible for 60% of China's growth. So in order to allow those companies to flourish, they need to introduce some new policies. But a lot of the policies that we're starting to see, whether it's anti-monopoly, whether it's rules around data, whether it's rules on tech, are perhaps trending in the direction that countries in the West might be looking at, but with a Communist Party spirit to them.
So for the investor, for the U.S. business going over there, is there a predictability to it? Because sometimes it feels like it just comes out of the blue, particularly some of the regulation we've seen in the big tech sector, some other places as well, private tutoring. Or is it more predictable than we think?
If you step back and look at the areas of Xi Jinping's priorities, one, to eliminate financial risk, two, to address poverty alleviation, and three, to focus on climate change. In that big picture, some of these steps are predictable, just in the way that they've implemented has come as a surprise. And so if we look at what they're doing in the context of whether it's DD and data is actually a very good example. One, because of the national security implications that they have, but also because they look at data as actually a factor of supply. And so as they're looking to transition the economy, in part focusing on rising consumer demand, but also they have considered in many sense that data was a free good that now there has to be a price on and there has to be some control over. So they're implementing new rules. And it was interesting to see that it was actually the Internet Authority that was the first in to do the investigations around Didi. It wasn't the financial authorities. And the restrictions that have come out as a result of further IPO listings are coming from the internet and the concerns over data and foreigners' access to data in China.
How much of this comes from President Xi himself?
As he came into office, I think that he sort of looked around, looked at the past 10 years of Hu Jintao and said that he had to get the country under control, that there had been limited reform, that the style of collective leadership had actually made it very difficult for Hu Jintao to get much done during his time, and that he also had many of the people from the previous administration, so to speak, from President Jiang Zemin around him, so he couldn't really implement his own vision. So what Xi has been doing, as I was saying, is one, getting his people into place, but two, he realized that in order to govern the country, he had to find a vehicle to do that, and a vehicle that reached from the top all the way down to the smallest cities, and that was the party. Because even when he was sitting in office, when he was coming out with new policies, even to this day, 10 years later, he still has policy enforcement teams that he has to send out into the provinces to ensure that policy is being implemented in the way that he expects. So I think as we look ahead and we look into next year, this political year, when he is going for the presidency, one of the things to watch is going to be the size of his standing committee. And this is, as you know, the group of usually men who rule China. They're the most powerful, and the number varies, 5, 7, 9. For Xi Jinping, it's in his interest to try and make that a smaller group so that he can have more control and less of this collective leadership. For others who still have control, and many of them are previous politicians whose people are still in place, it's going to be there and in their interest to push for a larger size. And I think that's one of the criteria that we should be watching to see how well he does and how well he's consolidating his power to implement policy going forward.
Deborah, as you know well, there are investors right now who are asking the serious question, is China investable at this point, given some of the things we've seen? When you think about investing, you've obviously got market opportunity in China. No one would deny that.
Right.
What about the political risk? During your time there, do you think it's going up right now or going down, the degree of political risk for investors?
Well, there's no question that it's going to be a bumpy road ahead for foreign investors, and that, as we said, while there may be some clarity around the direction that the Chinese government wants to go when it comes to whether it's market opening or the new regulations that they're taking, there isn't complete transparency on what the process is and the timing of any of the regulations. Take what we're seeing around the VIEs, these vehicles that are being used for many Chinese companies to actually get around the rules in China to establish overseas and then use that vehicle to invest. And that's the way that many foreigners are investing in the Alibabas and the other big companies in China. There was a rumor coming out of China that they were going to cut off that vehicle, which their regulatory authority has come out and said that's not true. But I am sure that what they're going to do is take a very serious look at what those entities look like and put some new rules around them. Because the whole intent of these VIEs was actually to get around the regulatory structure. So by their very nature, they need to bring some transparency and clarity to that. And that's going to make it very difficult for foreign investors to continue that route. And we're going to see more and more of these types of actions that, while in the big picture are understandable, perhaps from a Chinese context, for an investor, they're going to be unpredictable.
And finally, Deborah, maybe one of the big political risk questions, and that is human rights issues, because we saw this come up this week as Senator Mitt Romney really took on Ray Dalio, saying, how can you deny that there are real human rights violations? For an investor, put aside the morality of it just for a moment. For an investor or a company doing business in China, how does one factor that in? Is it a significant factor in decisions about how to go into China, how big to go into China?
I think the U.S. government has taken an important stance in its own set of values when it comes to voicing its concerns about human rights. For foreign investors, absolutely this is going to continue to be an issue. The Biden administration has stated very clearly that its expectation is that American companies will represent American values when they're overseas. How that is factored in is very complicated, because while American companies may take a stance, it's not necessary that all of our competitors are going to be taking the same stance. And I do think as part of this, we need to focus on what's the best interest of the American economy and American firms and American economic security, which is the basis really for our own national security. It's a very complicated question to factor in, but it's really a very critically important one.